sometimes the devil will be in the details, but I anticipate that 2024 will probably be as provocative and as stimulating as 2023 was.
Thanks for tuning in to Keep It Legal, the show where we break down concepts, litigation, and current events with our legal experts. I'm your host, Mark Anik. Okay, we're halfway down our list to number 5, and we're talking about bans adopted by the Texas legislature in 2023, which this year included and targeted library books in schools, drag shows, a piece of legislation later overturned by a federal court, and gender-affirming care for transgender children and teens. Let's listen to Dallas Appellate Attorney Chad Ruback and hear what he has to say on these issues.
The Texas legislature has enacted a number of statutes that are certain to face court scrutiny, might withstand the scrutiny, might not. The Texas legislature is not shy on pushing the envelope as to what they think they can get away with in terms of subsequent court scrutiny. It seems to me that at least one of these bills enacted by the Texas legislature, if not multiple bills enacted by the Texas legislature this last session, will end up before the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court is very much divided, much more so than the Texas Supreme Court. It will be interesting to see how the U.S. Supreme Court addresses some of these bills, if in fact the Supreme Court takes them up at all. I imagine there are a lot of far-right Texas voters who are going to be thrilled by what the Texas legislature has done in the past session. On the other hand, I imagine there are going to be a lot of moderate voters in Texas, folks who might consider themselves Republicans, but moderate Republicans, who are not going to be thrilled that the Texas legislature is focusing on some more far-right wing policies rather than meat and potatoes. We want to improve the quality of our schools. We want to improve the quality of our roads. We want to improve, the penal system, for example. There are absolutely positively going to be some middle of the road voters, even middle of the road Republican voters, who would prefer the Texas legislature focus on meat and potato issues rather than cater to the far right politically. With some of these new bills that have been passed, the trial courts, the appellate courts, the state courts, the federal courts, lawyers will have plenty of work thanks to the Texas legislature in this past session.
The notion of lawyers having a fair amount of work makes me chuckle just a little bit, I guess. But Chad does make the point, we talked about the drag show ban and a federal court already setting that aside. But the other two that we mentioned, books, gender-affirming care, and there are plenty of other laws that the legislature passed. Chad is of a mindset that one or more of these is headed to the Supreme Court. Agree, disagree?
Without a doubt, I think they're headed to the Supreme Court. Just to look at the book ban for a second, it does. It would be easy, perhaps, to dismiss that as a far right concern and as part of an overall political strategy. But the truth is that parents for many years have felt like they have lost control of their children's environment, including their schools. And as you know, Mark, as parents, we were far more involved than perhaps our parents were in our schooling. And so therefore, we feel a little bit more empowered. I can't help feel, though, that it's a little bit beside the point. While we might be quick to ban a cartoon of a rear end that appears in a school book, our children are being in some ways eaten alive by social media and the pressures of algorithms and peer pressure in social media. And so I think the Supreme Court and voters at some point will have to start making some decisions about what's truly relevant in our lives. But we'll see.
It's interesting, the cycle of these things politically, right? That we live in a time where we see the Texas legislature enacting these bans on books. It harkens back to a much earlier age and a different time in America altogether, and yet here we are in the 21st century, and we're dealing with some of these things. Continuing now, number 4 on our list is the fight over school vouchers or school choice, depending on where you stand, perhaps politically. House Bill number 1, which would have created an education savings account program for Texas families, was a top priority for the governor. Opponents say the program would steal public school funds and exacerbate existing funding shortfalls. Mike, as you know, we live in a state where the legislature meets only once every other year, and yet the governor called them back into session no fewer than 4 times to try to get this legislation through the legislature, and it did not work. So what do we make of that?
I think in some ways, Governor Abbott is cursed to be number 2 behind the governor of Florida. You know, Governor Abbott was a little bit behind the curve on immigration, and DeSantis took the initiative. And now on this issue, uh, Florida enacted similar measures in March of this year. And in Florida, folks are trying to figure out what it all means. Mark, it goes a little bit back to what I said earlier. Some parents feel like the public educational system is failing them. Um, the Republican Party, as a political tactic, is opposed to the teacher unions, which have been supportive of Democratic candidates largely. And so, at the end of the day, we'll have to decide what kind of society we want to have. I do take it seriously that if money is being siphoned off for private and independent religious schools, that's money that's not going to the public school system. But at the end of the day, voters will get to decide like what kind of school system they want. And in the meantime, we'll have to sort out, what the voucher system, if it gets passed in Texas, because the governor seems determined to make that happen, what that looks like, and whether that amount of money, I know in Florida it's about $8,000 a year, is enough for most families to afford a non-public school.
As a reporter, you covered the Texas legislature. This goes back to the 1990s. Does this legislature resemble that deliberative body in any way, shape, or form, or is this a different animal altogether now?
Well, the legislators individually and then as a body have always had pet causes that sometimes seem larger than what their constituents need or require. I think what's different now is that many of these issues are being raised to serve a fairly small, statistically small percentage of Texans. And, the legislators who have been proposing these measures have largely been successful. It gets them reelected, maybe as equally important, it gets them funded and financed. And, at some point, there might be an equal and opposite counterweight with more progressive policies. But at least for now, those politicians feel empowered that there's not any significant resistance. And so, these are issues that'll come up in every election.
Let's move on to our top 3. It's sometimes difficult to put these all in some sort of order, but we had 3 stories we think that really stood out this year. And one of them involves Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and the relationship that he has with Dallas billionaire Harlan Crow. Reports revealed that Crow paid for elaborate, expensive vacations for Justice Thomas without any disclosure on the justice's part, that Mr. Crow provided a private jet and even paid for boarding school for a young man Justice Thomas looks upon as a son. We asked legal ethics guru Randy Johnston of Johnston Toby Baruch to give us his thoughts.
I could not believe that a Supreme Court justice had accepted financial benefit at that level. And it turns out we learned even more later. It was even worse than we thought. And even more importantly, had not disclosed it. I was totally shocked that that had occurred. When the public loses respect for the integrity of the judicial process, courts mean nothing. There's a phrase that is often used by lawyers, the appearance of impropriety. That just gets washed aside, I think, too easily. Because even if Clarence Thomas would rule against Harlan Crow in a heartbeat, even if that were the case, and he would have absolutely no thought of favoring him the least for these hundreds of thousands of dollars of gift, a premise I reject, by the way, but even if that were the case, it looks so bad that if Harlan Crow were in the right and the court properly ruled for him, no one would believe it. The appearance of impropriety is so strong that it undermines the entire judicial process. They're the only 9 lawyers in the entire country that do not have a set of standards they're supposed to comply with.
You mentioned earlier when we were talking about another of the stories on our list, the need for lawyers to follow an ethical code. Let me just get your initial reaction. We all saw the Harlan Crow Justice Thomas story break. What did you think when you first heard about this?
It made me sad. You know, when I was a law student and we studied constitutional law, you know, implicit in all of our discussions was you could disagree with the court's opinion, you could disagree with an individual judge's point of view, but you would look around at the 3 branches of government, and you had, uh, even back when I was in law school, Congress was in ill repute. At least one president in my lifetime had been impeached. And here was the judiciary that you could look at and say, by golly, when all else fails, we can trust that our judges are going to be um, controlled only by their experience and their expertise and their view of the law. And now we don't have that anymore. And I think of all the erosions to our public institutions, the erosion of our faith in the judiciary has the biggest threat to our future as a democratic society. It really made me sad.
Does it help at all? I agree with you with regard to the sadness. I want there to be an ethical code. And by the way, the Supreme Court authored one subsequent to this, but of course it's not binding. And there were the further disclosures that Justice Alito had similar issues with a billionaire friend of his.
Right. And one of the Democrat, maybe Kagan, had her staff helping to sell a book. So it's not, it crosses party lines.
Correct. And thank you for that. I appreciate it. Does it give us any hope when we hear a Randy Johnston, though, and you and I know plenty of lawyers and a certain number of judges, right? Does it give us any hope when we hear a Randy Johnston talk about being out to lunch with one of his judge friends, and the judge friend is keeping track of who pays this time because he or she does not want to create the appearance of impropriety, as he mentions?
Well, absolutely. And, in my sadness, not for a second do I not believe that most judges and most officers of the court, which is every lawyer who practices in a courtroom, is ethical and really cares about it. And then, for all the criticism of the media, knowing in the work that we do, we know that often powerful people are guided by a strong desire, not to get caught, or to, if their actions will be illuminated someday, that they be viewed as ethical and proper. And so that is my hope, that, there are more jurists who are concerned. This appearance of impropriety sounds like a little thing, right? Because it's like, well, what is that really? But that's basically saying that even if you're in the right, but it somehow looks wrong, you shouldn't do it. And, most of us have a pretty good radar of what's appropriate and what's not. And when we do something that we think isn't appropriate, we know. And I felt in this case that Clarence Thomas and the people around him at some point surely should know, even if it's technically okay, it doesn't look right. And it does have ramifications. And I thought Randy Johnston was dead on when he said, even if the judge, rules against Harlan Crow, in a case that should happen to come up, it's still somehow tainted. And the judiciary does not want that, because at the end of the day, it could be the final arbiter of hugely important issues that affect all of us.
In 2000, it was the arbiter of who would be president of the United States. So
Right, and that could happen again.
it could happen again. All right, number two, we're going to get into something that is what we would consider a third rail issue, and that is we're discussing abortion. Since the United States Supreme Court overturned the landmark Roe v. Wade case, laws across the country and in Texas have been making headlines and causing controversy between doctors and lawmakers, and ultimately creating issues for women and their families. Recently, Travis County Judge Maya Guerra-Gamble handed down a temporary restraining order on behalf of Kate Cox, a North Texas woman who wanted to terminate her non-viable pregnancy under medical exemption. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton then went to court and put a stop to that. Ultimately, Ms. Cox left Texas to get an abortion, as there were concerns for her health and for her ability to continue to have more children in the future. Attorney David Cole, an appellate lawyer at Lynn Pinker Hurst and Schwegman, had this to say.
There are two takeaways. One is, if you have a really complex pregnancy where abortion is something that your healthcare providers are considering, you're better off leaving Texas sooner rather than later. And the second takeaway was that this tactic of going to court before a procedure to try to get sort of a pre-clearance from the courts is just not going to work. I think the proponents of these statutes learned that they aren't as popular at the ballot box as they might have thought. And there's been this steady drumbeat over the last year of cases like Ms. Cox that are very difficult. We're talking about a statute that's designed to be used in prosecuting somebody where you come back with a defense against it. So you could imagine prosecutions somewhere down the line where a prosecutor says an abortion took place, the doctor claims there was medical necessity, and they are wrong. I have a doctor who knows better than that doctor, and I can prove that defense isn't so. And I think that possibility is something that has a lot of healthcare providers concerned in Texas. There's a chilling effect to that. Now, is any prosecutor going to actually bring that case against a well-meaning provider who acted in good faith? That's unlikely, particularly in a big city in Texas. But the threat is still out there. And if you're general counsel to a hospital, you're going to take it seriously when you advise your client about good policies. The Texas problem with it is one that's shared nationally with these laws. Everybody was in a hurry to pass a new abortion criminal law after Roe was overturned. And they're all drafted by lawyers and not doctors. And the fit between what lawyers think looks reasonable as a matter of criminal law and what doctors and hospitals think is reasonable as a matter of good practice is not all that great.
Mike, earlier you made this point in one of our top 10 stories about 50 different states and 50 different rules or laws, right? We might have been talking about the migration issues and all of that. It strikes me that we're dealing with very much the same thing with regard to abortion.
Right. Republican presidential candidate Chris Christie has embraced that. He said, hey, the Supreme Court has spoken. Now each state can do what it wants. And I do think that, the Supreme Court does not and will not revisit this issue, not for a very, very long time. And so it will be left to the states to sort it out. And I do think in Texas, the courts have sort of pleaded with the state medical authorities to come up with some sort of protocols or hypotheticals for situations that arise. And I think that over time, that'll happen. And we will be a patchwork quilt across the country. And some states will have legalized abortion, and some states, such as Texas, will not.
That raises a provocative question in my mind. I guess it's how united are we in a United States of America where there are potentially 50 different laws depending on jurisdiction and geography?
Sure, and those who delve into federalist policy would argue that it shows a very healthy democracy, that was the original intent of our constitutional founders, that the federal government had limited authority, mostly around defense, and it was left to the states to sort out how they lived, how they wanted to live, and how they wanted to interact with one another. The counter is that it's a much more complex society these days, and we're intertwined in a lot of different ways, not only nationally and domestically, but internationally. And can a society and a country stand with 50 states doing different things? We're an extremely resilient country, and I'm somewhat hopeful we can sort through that.
Let's move to our number one story. There was perhaps no story bigger in the state of Texas than the historic impeachment of Attorney General Ken Paxton, who later was acquitted on all 16 articles of impeachment. It was anything but ordinary, between the trial being neither civil nor criminal, or the jurors being openly lobbied at times during the proceedings. Amongst the history makers was the House Managers Counsel, Rusty Hardin, who shares what it was like to participate in state history.
Our firm had to come in and learn what this case was about in 90 days and be ready to put it on. And they get all the credit. I'd take none for whatever small role I had. But those people worked unbelievably hard, sometimes 19-hour days. What we had to do is master I think we produced during the trial close to 4,000 documents. Think about that. And we had to absorb them and learn them within that short period of time. And then the team had to figure out which witnesses we're going to use and then what documents go with these witnesses. Just like a normal trial that you usually take a year to year and a half to 2 years to prepare. We had to issue new subpoenas by the Senate. The Senate would then determine when they issued them after we applied for them. And so we didn't get the documents until shortly before trial in most situations. I will never be prouder of any effort of any people I've ever worked with than I was with these people that were on the impeachment team. They were phenomenal. I was tremendously impressed with the political courage the House had to vote the impeachment in spite of all the pressure from members of their own party and the Republican Party. And I thought that the matter needed to be heard. And I felt really obligated to those who had the courage to put it forward, to at least try to do the very best we could.
You know, when you take that out of the political context for just a moment, not that you can, but you think about it from a legal perspective as Rusty speaks, the notion of having to go to trial in that short a period of time, absorbing 4,000 documents and figuring out the witnesses and doing all of that in 90 days, it's really extraordinary, notwithstanding the outcome.
Yeah, if you watch the trial, I was really impressed with the lawyering on both sides. I thought, there was a lot of potential that to be a slapdash or hyperbolic trial, and there were moments, right? But overall, I thought the lawyering on both sides was excellent.
And this case is far from over, even though it's over in the Senate. You have the whistleblowers and their civil case still out there. Just this week, the Dallas Morning News named those 8 whistleblowers the Texans of the Year. And that case is still winding its way through the system. It was the proposed settlement there that prompted the impeachment.
Yeah, and I have a theory that in the way that Donald Trump might be a model for our attorney general, I wonder if Ken Paxton is not a model for other, let's say mostly Republican, but maybe not just Republican, public figures around the country. I think in hindsight, many people would feel like there were two trials going on. There was the legal case that I thought Rusty Hardin and his team had proved, but then there was the political case that Tony Busby propounded. That you could not really anticipate the impact of these jurors who are state senators being lobbied in real time uh, via text and social media as the trial was going on. And I just can't believe that there won't be lessons learned there, maybe on both sides going forward. Not that there's going to be impeachments around the country everywhere, but I think the lesson that the Ken Paxton prosecution impeachment shows is if it's a political trial, marshal your base, get your funding, uh, get your allies close, and then galvanize like it's a war. And that's what I thought that the Paxton forces did here.
You know, as we put together this list this year, I was impressed with the items that were on it and the quality of the comments from people we had the privilege to speak with. And as you and I have gone through them one by one, it occurs to me, boy, there's an awful lot of meat here. There's an awful lot of very important issues that affect each of us as citizens living here in Texas.
Yeah, these are exciting times. I mean, at a fundamental level, we are definitely tinkering with our government and how our government interacts with the people, and that's exciting. Like good ideas can come from all sides, and sometimes the devil will be in the details. But I anticipate that 2024 will probably be as provocative and as stimulating as 2023 was.
Mike Androvett, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Forgive us for having taken a year to have you in as a guest. We're going to have you back at some point again in the future.
You're doing a great job, Mark, and thank you for allowing me to participate. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it. If you, as a listener, would like to go through our top 10 list, you can do so by visiting our website, androvett.com. That's ANDROVETT.com. Make sure to like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and tune in next time to Keep It Legal. I'm your host, Mark Anik. We'll see you then.